Hi everyone, welcome to this latest in our Unlocked series of In Conversations. It's so much nicer when it's still light, isn't it? Just so much nicer this time of year. I'm delighted to welcome for our event this time, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman. Laurie is, well, you're still at King's, aren't you? You're an Emeritus Professor here at King's now. You taught here from 1982 to 2014. You were Vice Principal for quite a chunk of that time, about 10 years, I think you were Vice Principal. Laurie must be known to all of you. He has written very, very widely. I remember as a PhD student reading his Evolution of Nuclear Strategy. You're probably due another...
It came out 2019, fourth
Yeah, I
edition.
know, 2019 is a long time ago in today's world, Laurie. I think you're probably due another volume of that. He also runs one of the best Substacks around with his son, and it's got the coolest name, Comment is Freed. When I first saw that, I thought, bugger, that's such a good name. That is such a good name. So, as usual, the format will be as it always is. We'll have a chat for about sort of 45 minutes or so, and then open up to audience questions. So, Laurie, welcome. First and foremost, let's start, I think, with Ukraine. And I suppose your starter for 10 is, where is the war at now? Where have we reached? What is the situation now?
I mean, it hasn't moved very far for a long time in terms of the basic structure of the conflict. In the first year, there was a lot of back and forth. Started off everybody assuming Russia had to win. Then it became apparent that the Russians weren't going to win. Then it seemed Ukraine was pushing the Russians back. And then September 22, which I think is a real turning point in the war, Putin doubled down. And we're living with the consequences of that still, because he did enough to make sure that lines could hold. He moved to much more systematic attacks on infrastructure, so the economy was more on a war footing. He mobilized more people. Importantly, he expanded his objectives so that instead of just, well, it wasn't clear what his territorial objectives were to start, but after that point, September 22, it was the annexation of 4 oblast provinces. And that's still the objective, though only one of those is more or less under Russian occupation, Luhansk. The other 3, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, are still between 2/3, maybe 80% in Russian hands, but the rest, including the cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia, are not. So we've had this strain. Then there was the Ukrainian offensive, which didn't do as well as we hoped, petered out. And since late 23, it's basically been a grinding, high-cost Russian offensive, Ukrainian defense, and not a lot has changed in terms of the look of the battlefield. The big difference over the last few months has been obviously Trump's attempts to get peace, and he apparently just had another phone call with Putin, which even Trump says hasn't advanced the cause of peace. And I think what's come out of that is nothing remarkable in terms of new negotiations, but absolute clarity that Putin does not want, as Trump thought he wanted, a ceasefire. He wants a victory. And if he can't achieve his victory in military terms, he wants them through negotiations, which clearly the Ukrainians aren't going to give him. So I think what we've got is clarity about political positions, but we're still stuck with this situation in which the Russians are taking hundreds of thousands of casualties, thousands sometimes a week, making some progress. It's not the case that it's completely static front lines, but nothing like the progress they need to meet their political objectives. Ukraine hasn't got much choice. I mean, Ukraine will fight and is fighting. Perhaps just the last thing to say about where are we. Sorry, this is
no, that's all right.
Quite a long answer. obviously, one of the things that's happened quite a lot over the last even few days is these massive Russian strikes against Ukrainian cities. What was it, 444 some drones or whatever the last weekend. But you're also seeing increasing Ukrainian strikes into Russian territory, and these will increase. What's interesting, and clearly from what Trump said after his talk with Putin, got under Putin's skin, is the one that attacked air bases thousands of kilometers away from the border in very ingenious and clever methods, which used 117 drones, each one costing a few $100, and take out what the Ukrainians claim. But I mean, these aren't planes that are going to be replaced, but say worth $2 billion worth of aircraft. But about 20% of the Russian strategic bomber force. That's quite a thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop the war, but it's and I don't think the war stops until Putin changes his political objectives. I just can't see and accepts that this current situation is futile.
Were you surprised? I mean, a lot of observers seem to assume that Russia would win very quickly when the war broke out. Did you make those sorts of assumptions? Or?
No.
Well done.
One of the advantages of having a Substack is I can show what I thought at the time I thought it.
Well, some people edit their Substacks after the event, I hear.
I can't imagine who you're talking about, but I don't. Though I could. Now you mention it. So I wrote the day after the war, after the full-scale invasion. Obviously, the war started in 2014. I wrote that this is a war Putin can't win, and the reason for that was, unless they had achieved their immediate objective of taking Kyiv and overthrowing the government, they couldn't win. Now, it was a bit of a bold statement to make nonetheless, because the Russians were still trying. But even by then, I think it was evident that the Ukrainians were going to fight, that they would fight cleverly, that international support, even reluctantly, would come in behind Ukraine. And once you reach that situation, then there were just limits on what Russia could do, given that the objective was to subjugate Ukraine. If the issue was just about NATO, there could have been a deal. If the issue was just about Donetsk and Luhansk, then you could have gone back to the Minsk and so on. But that wasn't the objective. The objective, as Putin put it, was demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, which didn't mean what we might mean by those terms, but it certainly meant the subjugation of Ukraine and regime change. So that was and I'd written that before, that I thought, which is why I thought the invasion was stupid, because I think people always exaggerate. Anybody launching an invasion has to convince themselves that it's a good idea, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And Putin was working with a view of Ukraine as an artificial state with an illegitimate government that would fall apart, and it didn't.
Is this a war that Ukraine can win?
It's difficult, because you come back again to the question of what winning is. I would define victory not in terms of battles. The battles may be important, but in terms of reaching political objectives. The political objectives of Russia I've described. The political objectives of Ukraine are to get Ukrainian territory back, of which about 20% is held by Russia. 10% of that was held before the start of the full-scale invasion. The rest taken since. And that's very difficult. I mean, it's if you accept a ceasefire, you're accepting de facto that you're going to struggle to get a lot of that territory back. It's a victory in the sense that the other objective of Ukraine is to exist as a sovereign, independent state, able to form its own partnerships, alliances, eventually join the EU, maybe eventually even NATO. If it can do that, compared with what might have been, it's a sort of victory. But I don't think it would feel this quite a victory to Ukraine while its territory is still occupied. So they won't accept de jure. I mean, Putin's demand is not only do they sort of concede the annexation, but they hand over territory that the Russians have so far failed to take, which they're not going to do. So it's a de facto Russian occupation. And it's just finally worth saying that this de facto occupation is a bit of a poison chalice for Russia. It's a ruined territory in many ways, depopulated, economically inactive now, full of unexploded ordnance. Hostile, some parts of the population are not hostile, but large chunks are, vulnerable to sabotage, with a long front line that will need defended. And that's part of Putin's problem with the ceasefire. That's why he wants a political settlement that puts Ukraine in its place. Because as long as Ukraine can rearm, sustain its armed forces, and hold to the idea of the liberation of its own territory, then he's got a problem on his hands as what he does with this territory.
I mean, do you see any imminent prospect of a ceasefire? And there's a lot of talk of it. I just find it very hard to imagine a scenario where it happens, given where we are now.
I think, I didn't think there would be a prospect of a ceasefire because I looked at what Putin wrote and said, what he said when he set out his demands last June. He reiterated them in December. And every time Trump said, "Oh no, Putin's good with this," actually Peskov and others went out of their way to make it clear they weren't. Yeah. And I think this was why we led to such bizarre sort of pressure on Zelensky, as if he was the barrier to peace. So, Zelensky then correctly realized that he had very little to lose by accepting the case for a ceasefire, and put Putin on the spot, which is what's happened. So the only hesitation I have is, I think for Putin, if this effort, as it's likely to do, but if this effort sort of just peters out without anything, this is probably his best chance with a sympathetic American president to get a deal, to get a sort of negotiated way out. And that if he did accept a ceasefire and political negotiations thereafter, his argument is you have a ceasefire only after a political settlement is agreed. If he had it the other way around, you could keep on going for years with negotiations, and he might as well fail to achieve his objectives in negotiations over an extended period as to fail to achieve them by military means. But so I think that, rationally, if Putin wanted a way out, this is probably his best time to get it. I don't think it's going to get that much easier for him, but I think that this is more than just, and this is something very deep in Putin. I think this matters to him a lot.
And there's no sign of sort of domestic pushback against this war of choice, is there, in Russia either? Despite
well, first of all, the people who would have pushed back are now out of Russia. They're in exile, or they just left. Secondly, there's a war economy. There's an odd form of redistribution going on. So in the poorer parts of Russia, men are being paid handsome bounties, very handsome bounties, to sign up. And that's helping local economies. So, this has turned a bit. Turned since late last year, but for a couple of years the economy was growing, the stuff in the shops. So if you don't mind the fact that you're losing more men in war than you've lost since 1945, because they're not in Moscow. The numbers from Moscow are incredibly small, or St. Petersburg. These are from the outlying regions. Quite a lot. Initially, there were sort of more the regulars were from the core Russia, but less now. So there isn't a lot of sign, and there's indeed a sort of quite strong nationalist push that I think Trump worries about more than an anti-war faction, that if after all this, his best chance, Ukraine is not brought back into sort of become part of Mother Russia again, that this will be an enormous failure. And I think that's part of the pressure upon him. Now this can change because the economy is not in a wonderful state. It's a boom economy, and booms tend to be followed by bust. Inflation very high, interest rates 21%. If the oil price stays down, that's a problem. So I don't think it's sustainable in the long term, but at the moment it is.
I mean, I get the impression, what do I know, that just from the outside, that this has been quite a revolutionary war in terms of the way the Ukrainians have fought it, and it will alter how we think about war and possibly how we do war into the future. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, if just looking at the UK Defence Review, you can see the influence of, and the UK has worked very closely with Ukraine. You can see the influence of the experiences, part in drone warfare, in use of digitization, and so on. And the Ukrainians have had to fight smart. They haven't always fought smart. I mean, you've got to be. They've made mistakes. It hasn't always gone as they would wish, but you do see a lot of ingenuity, as the attack last weekend demonstrated. I think we knew drones were going to be important in this war. I mean, they were important early on, but initially the drones involved were quite big and expensive. What I don't think anybody was prepared for was thousands and thousands of drones in the air every day, many quite expendable, to the point where it's in the front lines, it's very difficult to move without being seen. And if you're seen, you can be struck. And this affects both sides. It's why offensives are so hard and so grinding. So it is changing the way we think about war. I think we have to be a little careful because it is still context dependent. Air power has played less of a role than we might have expected. And the drone warfare has developed when the front line sort of settled. So you've got this very concentrations of force, just a lot of people there at the front. Whereas in other wars where forces are more thinly spread and there's more movement, it wouldn't be the same. Nonetheless, I think it raises questions of if you've got choices, whether you're going to put it into large objects that can be easily hit or large numbers of small objects. And the advantage of the large numbers of small objects is mass. I mean, I think one of the things that I think we forgot in the West with fighting counterinsurgency campaigns is, which was all, it wasn't big battles.
Yeah.
We forgot just the importance of numbers, and numbers have been very important. And Russia, and it's still Russia's advantage. It has the numbers.
We'll come back to the SDR and what that was all about in a moment. But just, there's been a lot of talk, a hell of a lot of meetings discussing this so-called coalition of the willing. Can you see a day when there are European troops trying to uphold a ceasefire in Ukraine on the ground?
I think it's shifted a bit from that. I mean, the issue arose when it looked like Trump was likely to force through a ceasefire on his assumption that Putin would go along, which of course Putin didn't. And Zelensky's anxiety, which is what was expressed in that famous Oval Office meeting, was that after the ceasefire, what Russia would reconstitute, what would happen if he came again. And given that Trump didn't seem inclined to provide any sort of guarantees, where would they come from? And Zelensky and Macron and Starmer and so on came in and said, we'll provide something. And that's where the coalition of the willing came from. And that offer is still there. I think as people looked at it, I think they realized that you weren't actually going to be able to get very many European troops in just because it's expensive and difficult. If you're going to have 10,000 troops, I mean, you need more than that, but you had 10,000 troops. Actually, you need 30 because you need 10,000 training, 10,000 there, and 10,000 recuperating. So it would be quite a commitment. I think the view now is more that if there was support needed, it would be air support and possibly maritime, maybe some land training missions or whatever to the west of the country, but not promising this sort of backup. In the end, the main work would always have to be done by Ukrainians. So the main requirement would always be to find ways of boosting frontline Ukrainian forces, and probably that could best be done by air support. But that would be a serious business. I mean, it's not. This is not the sort of thing that you would do now, I think, because that would be a step change in the European commitment to the war. I mean, I could make a case for it, but I just don't think that will happen. But once there's a ceasefire, then it to stabilise the situation, to deter non-compliance, it makes more sense. But at the moment, we're somewhere away from that.
And just on Trump, I mean, do you think he could, if he wanted to, force Putin to alter his war aims at this point?
I think Putin doesn't want to fall out with Trump over this. I think the Russians believed that they had, maybe still have an opportunity to normalize relations, but they put Trump under in some embarrassment, even for Trump. It's not, as we know, is rarely embarrassed. And so there are discussions of economic sanctions, and Trump could make life with the Europeans more difficult on oil movement and so on. But I don't think Trump the US by itself can do. Putin believes this is a core Russian security interest now, and he's got himself in a fix. In a box. If he accepted a ceasefire, he's clearly failed in what he has been very explicit about, and that's pretty hard for him to do. Now, in my mind and others, how long he can keep on doing this, I have no idea, because I don't think in a year's time Russia is going to be necessarily in a much better position. I thought they were in a better position last year than they are this year, when, if you remember, there was the supplemental bill in the US Congress was held up, partly because of Trump, until April last year. And Ukraine was very short of munitions and so on. Still the Russians couldn't win even then. So if we're still in the same position in a year's time, which is perfectly possible, at what point does somebody in the Kremlin say, really, how long are we going to do this for? The moment, and in the first meeting that they had in Istanbul, but not the last one, the one before, the guy in charge of the Russian delegation sort of invoked the Russian-Swedish wars of many centuries ago to show how long the Russians were prepared to fight. I mean, that's their message.
Okay, that's interesting. And do you think the Europeans in particular, because it might fall on them yet, have the appetite to keep supplying Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's, I do actually. I mean, I think if you look back at the talk around in early 2022, sort of spring 2020, when the energy crunch hit and so on, there was talk of Ukraine fatigue and so on. And of course, there's issues if Le Pen or whoever it is wins the French election or AFD, there are obvious issues, but actually the Europeans have been pretty solid. And I think in a way, what happened with Trump galvanized the Europeans into more activity, not only in terms of their own defenses, but in support of Ukraine. So I mean, you know, who knows? But so far, I think they've done pretty reasonably well. And it's built in. I mean, as you know, once the EU has got a policy, it's actually quite hard to change it.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And I think we've got a bipartisan position in the UK. So I think certainly for the next couple of years, it could be sustained.
And of course, the other thing that Trump has done is to cast doubt on NATO or the reliability of the American guarantee. Now, I don't suppose anyone really knows what Donald Trump thinks about this or what his intentions are. But has the Article 5 guarantee, has NATO been weakened by the first months of this presidency, do you think?
Well, it hasn't been strengthened. I think they've moved a bit. So on Article 5, Trump said, it's still there. I'm taking it away. I don't think we need it, but he hasn't removed it. And some of the thinking in the Pentagon at the moment appears to be that they'll be able to reduce the numbers of American forces in Europe, in part because they're still providing the guarantee.
Yeah.
And so I think we just have to assume that the American footprint in Europe will shrink, and the Europeans will have to do more. And that's been the position of presidents in the past for a long time, that the Europeans should do more, and we probably should. So I don't think that in itself is harmful. You don't know when a crisis comes, what would happen. If Trump had been president in February 22, one worries as to what he might have done then, but he wasn't. So it's fine until it's properly tested, and you have to hope it's not tested over the next few years. And the real damage is being done by things like tariffs and so on. I think will be souring relations for some time to come. But I suspect NATO will cope. There's no incentive, despite talk of European strategic autonomy and so on, there really isn't that much appetite to try to cope without the Americans to, say, well, if that's what you think, go away. I think by and large, they want to keep the Americans engaged. For the UK, it would be a real problem.
No, absolutely.
It would, and you've got Five Eyes and intelligence and so on. But, when you've got somebody who at times can appear like a Russian asset as a director of national intelligence, it's a bit unnerving if you're trying to share intelligence. So it's not great.
Well, especially if you're Canada.
Yes. Yeah. And if you talk to the Canadians, then, I think with Canada, it goes very deep. It's because it's not only insulting and harmful, it's like the family, and it sort of made Canada more monarchist, I guess. But there's certain advantages in the constitutional monarchy as against an all-powerful president. But it's hurtful. It's very hurtful. With us, I think it's annoying and exasperating, but we can cope. It's very different there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just sticking to Europe for a minute, it's a curious thing to say about such an institutionally dense region, but there doesn't seem to be an organisation or an institution that Europeans can use even to do low-level military stuff together at the moment.
No, I don't think that's wholly true. You've got a number of sort of bilateral, multilateral initiatives. You've got the Joint Expeditionary Force that's in northern Europe, the UK, very much involved with that, with the Scandinavians. So I think there are structures. I think the structure that doesn't work sufficiently is the EU. Because, if you look at the London meeting that Starmer organised after it was organised before, but it came after the Oval Office fiasco. 5 of the countries there were not EU members: Ukraine, UK, Norway, Turkey, and Canada. So I think at the moment you can use the NATO structures anyway. There are quite a lot of activity within NATO. EU is a separate thing. And EU is doing more, particularly on the procurement side, and the UK is now coming in on that. So there's plenty of places to talk, but there isn't an alternative to NATO. I mean, that brings everybody together. So I think it's the coalition of the willing is probably what describes responses to most sorts of crises that may come up.
But it helps to have institutions to buttress them, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But I mean, the NATO's still there, and you know, it sets the standards, it sets interoperability. It's people know each other. The contacts are all there. The working groups still meet and so on. So command structures are still in place. I think, you know, one of the big issues, and what I think will actually put limits on the American withdrawal, is the Supreme Allied Command, which has always been an American, started with Eisenhower. And I think Congress and the Army will not want to see that handed over to anybody else. So that probably puts a limit on. Also, people, I think once the Pentagon does its sums, it'll realise just how expensive it is to move people out of existing bases.
Yeah. I also think there's now a conversation in the United States about weaponry. You've seen some Europeans, you've seen the Portuguese question their purchase of F-35s.
Yeah.
And that's going to...
Yeah, but, well, that's going to be, you know, Trump is, so, you know, you must do more for yourself, but buy American, you know. There's a contradiction there. But, you know, a lot of times the American kit is the best kit. And it's, you know, once you're committed to this kit, it's quite hard to get out of it. It takes a long time.
Yeah. Though I suppose the flip side is, if you're not sure if at any point the software can get turned off by someone else, that is going to...
Yeah, that's good. Those sort of things make a difference. Yeah.
Just turning to the UK, obviously we had the Strategic Defence Review published on Monday. How significant a moment, actually, for those of you who want to, if you read the Substack, there's a really good analysis there.
Yeah, good.
But just for the moment, how big a deal is the Strategic Defence Review? I
was quite positive about it. I think it's a shame that every time there's a defence review, all people talk about is, will the Treasury stump up? And I think the defence review is written on the assumption that there will be 3% in the next Parliament, but you know, it's very difficult to commit the next Parliament when you don't quite know the economic circumstances. At any rate, my analysis is that the most important part of the defence review were the short-term proposals. I mean, I think it was good. I think the experiment of having serious external reviewers work, because they're much more, there's a candour, an impatience. I mean, it's not a, you know, it's pretty honest about the failings of the last decade and the way the forces have got hollowed out. And it makes, I think, some pretty strong, some of them were talking about, recommendations for what you need to do in the short term. So I think, my view of the review is the tests come in the short term. It's about reorganising the Ministry of Defence, a more unified command, integrating the armed forces more, using more digitisation, doing something about the recruitment and retention, which has been dismal, introducing, you know, taking advantage of what we know about drone warfare and so on. It talks about the foundational capabilities, which are, you know, just having enough munitions. You know, there's a lot of medical services, a lot of very basic stuff that's got neglected. So I was quite positive about it and remain positive. Again, you know, you can be as positive as you like, but it still has to be implemented, and it will require culture change in the Ministry of Defence. And you know, anybody who's talked about the way that procurement is done in the Ministry of Defence, with one sort of committee after another, it just gets out of hand. And clearly, the government is aware of that, but government has been aware of that for a long time. So are they going to be able, and here the Ukraine example becomes important, interject that urgency and sort of get rid of the bureaucratic logjams. They're the tests, and they're short-term tests. So if they're passed, then you're in a better position for the next decade anyway. If you flunk these tests, then the Treasury will quite legitimately, I think, wonder what you're going to do with even more money.
I mean, it's slightly more profound than that as well, isn't it? Because in a way, part of what they're saying about technology is the need to sort of sidestep the primes, get to smaller, nimbler, more agile, more innovative firms. And I sort of read that bit and thought, I mean, that's going to be difficult. You think about path dependence and the way bureaucracies work, and
yeah, I mean, it requires. I mean, there has been quite a bit of work going on over the past year on this, and of course, if software is becoming more and more important, then you don't have to go to British Aerospace for everything.
Yeah,
and I think so there are ways of doing it, and I know some people who've been trying to engage more. But it all goes to the contracts branch in Glasgow, and these guys. It's not a very exciting job, and there's boxes to tick. And I think that's so you need very different. It's very basic stuff, and this is I write about strategy, but I always argue that the tactics are very important. Unless you could find ways to engage actively with where the change is needed, the culture will reassert itself. So it requires people digging quite deep and getting into the nature of the organisations, rather than just sort of saying here's a policy, which we can have hundreds of policies, but you actually need to do it.
I mean, the Prime Minister used some quite striking language on Monday when he was sort of announcing this. And one of the things he said was, every part of society, every citizen of this country has a role to play. The front line, if you like, is here. Do you think the population are on the same page as the government when it comes to the scale of the threat we face, the urgency?
I mean, it's hard for me to know. I mean, I think the population. I mean, the polls suggest people are broadly supportive of the way it's going. I think what's hard to get over, because of just the way we think about war, and we're just assuming this means conscription and everybody charging around every weekend, learning how to fire their pistols and so on. It's not. The challenges are in cyber, some sabotage, information campaigns or whatever. And these are different. I mean, I think finding the right language for this sort of thing is very difficult, because it's sort of finding the right balance between alarmism and complacency. Yeah. You don't want to. I got an email out of the blue last year when all this talk about conscription was going on, and she said, my children have just been born, and are my boys going to have to fight and so on. And it was, it was genuine and heartfelt. And you get these, this person, and well, I don't think so, but I don't know. In the end, all you can do is control what you can control. Bring your kids up as well as you can. But there's you can see that if you're not careful, you generate anxieties. Yeah. Without actually people knowing what to do about it. Now, there are some interesting ideas in the paper about how you talk about these things at schools and so on, but you'll get resistance to that, because when sort of militarization of society, teaching our kids to kill and all that sort of thing. But I think it's, I think it's going to be hard. I think that side of it is hard. But it's a function of political leadership, is to find ways to talk about these issues. I don't like talk of pre-war and things like that, just because that sounds like a war's inevitable. It isn't. I don't think you shouldn't build Russia up to be more than it is. But the fact is that there have been acts of sabotage in the UK and throughout Europe. There are regular cyber attacks. And, you know, if anybody who has the misfortune to watch some of the Russian state media knows that the UK is regularly picked on as a particularly despicable place and deserving of the worst possible punishment. So, you know, people should be aware of that.
On the conscription issue, I think it's more in common. I've been doing some wonderful polling that shows every age group of the population is broadly in favour of conscription, except people in their 20s who think it's a really, really bad idea.
Indeed.
Which is...
It is not. I mean, conscription isn't a particularly good idea, just because, I mean, I think you can make a case for some sort of public service for 18 to 20-year-olds or whatever. But actually just means an awful lot of time is spent training people who don't want to be trained, and you're using up a lot of your military capacity doing that, which is why the army was never particularly in favour. More reserves, which they do talk about, makes much more sense, and encouraging people to spend
making
more
the conditions better.
And you can commission people to be in the reserves. So I think Scandinavians have got some pretty interesting models on that. And I think there you know, if people don't want to do it, they shouldn't be forced to do it. But I think you'd probably find enough who would be interested, and you know, would be good. We certainly, I mean, you know, one of the big problems, we just don't have enough people in the forces, and you need them.
The Scandinavian example brings us back to that alarmism versus complacency, doesn't it? Because there's a pretty well-developed sense of threat when it comes to Russia in Scandinavian countries, isn't there? And
well, if you talk to the Finns, I mean, they're sort of up for it, you know.
Yeah.
they you know, we fought them before, and they didn't like it, and we can do it again. But you know, Finland's a very homogenous society, very resilient, and right up there with them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you know, Russia puts itself about, and you know, the Swedes, you know, the sort of the great achievement of the special military operation that was designed to prevent the further expansion of NATO is that Finland and Sweden are now, and both are very serious players. I mean, they're not marginal.
No, absolutely.
They make a big difference.
I mean, I know you didn't want to talk about this, but I'm going to mention it quickly, because the other thing you've got to do is persuade people to spend more, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I'm not against talking about it at all.
Well, it's not the only issue.
But
clearly,
my concern was just that when you know, every commentary started off with, will they get 3%, and then you get some, you know, this sort of new thing. Oh, you know, NATO's going to demand 3.5%. Well, anybody who knows how NATO targets work knows full well that just because there's a NATO target doesn't mean it has to be met. So I think the money's important. You know, when we started a year ago, it was, you know, the Chancellor didn't want to go to 2.5% until the next Parliament, effectively. We've improved on that. Now the 3% is being spoken about as likely, but you can't be sure. If things get really bad, then they'll have to find more. If things get better, then no doubt the Treasury will want to rein everything in. But you know, in 2010, we were spending 2.5%. There's nothing historically high about what we're spending at the moment. It's historically pretty low. It's just that all public expenditure is under a lot of pressure for reasons that we all know. But you know, in the end, we're in a security crisis.
it's also, in a way, a strange way to define a functional outcome, isn't it, as a proportion of a number that changes.
It's a NATO thing. I mean, the easiest way to meet our targets is to have a full-blown recession. And then, you know, we could be at 3% in no time at all. It wouldn't actually be helping defence very much. No, I think it's a silly way to go about things. But it
helps comparison between members.
But it helps comparison between member states.
I will be coming to you lot for questions in a minute. I just want to ask a few broaden this out a little bit, because the world feels like a very turbulent place at the moment. And increasingly, I go to all these events where people say it's like, you know, this reminds me of the 1930s. The 1930s are getting mentioned an awful lot. You find that convincing?
Well, I don't quite remember the 1930s.
No, I don't mean from memory. From your work as a historian.
Well, I work as a historian. I think I'm always wary of historical analogies like that, because we know how the 30s ended up. It doesn't do any harm to... historians have a keen sense of tragedy. You know that things sometimes end very badly. You don't believe the arc of history always points to justice. Sometimes it just points to utter disaster.
Yeah.
And so I think a sense of tragedy is quite useful because it reminds us that there are things, there's a lot to play for, and that you shouldn't just assume it'll all be right in the end. It's different from the 30s in all sorts of ways. There's no point in going, every decade is different, and this has got its own special features. I think the special features of the moment, which is not what you would have said last year, is that the US is extracting itself as a sort of the dominant power. And also, and this is in the sort of soft powery ways as much as the hard power. You will not look necessarily, as you have done in the past, for the US to lead on pandemics, on major disasters, on climate change, on all sorts of things. The US as the world leader in higher education and medical research, which impossible to replicate anywhere else, is being severely damaged. And we'll live with this for a long time. What is going on with tariffs? It's crazy, absolutely crazy. And so, we're likely to have, whether we'll have a major recession, global, I don't know. But it's going to damage the American economy if nobody else's. It'll damage the American economy, every European economy, Chinese, everybody's economy. And, we're still living with the consequences of the 2009-10 recession. So I think there are a lot of things to worry about. The other sort of different thing is China. And we haven't worked out how to cope with China, because unlike the Soviet Union, which was marginal to the rest of the international economy, China is
central.
It's absolutely central. It's in manufacturing. The idea that all this stuff that the Chinese manufacturer is going to go back to the US is for the birds. And it might go to India and it might go to Indonesia and so on, but it's not going to go back to the US. So we're all trying to work that out. And I think and given the way that the US is moving at the moment on trade, it gives, it hurts China, of course, at the moment as well. And China's made its own mistakes, but it gives China opportunities that weren't there before, more in Asia than here, but still. So I think that there's just a lot, as you said, there's a lot going on. And it's very hard to get your head around it all at times, because it could still go in a number of ways. There's this thing about Trump always caving. And Trump's capable of walking away from policies he doesn't like, that aren't working, that are producing bad headlines and so on. But tariffs are sort of in his bloodstream. These are things he's been talking about since the 80s. And this is his signature policy more than anything else. Well, deportations and so on, the immigration and that. Those two things are his signature policies.
And they're a revenue stream.
And a revenue stream. And it's already clear it's not a revenue stream. So, you've got this discussion at the moment about a deficit which is massive, to which they're about to add another, goodness knows how many $1 trillion. And it's just reckless in many ways. Now, I think we'll see what, if Congress rose back. Even Musk thinks it's reckless. So, but I think I think they're the things that actually worry me more than most, because, we know from just looking at election results, the sort of Western democracies in a sort of febrile state at the moment, And the last thing we need is a big economic downturn.
And actually, that strikes me as another factor that complicates the picture and makes it really hard to talk about, the things we used to talk about in foreign policy, like the national interest, because our societies are so polarised, so fundamentally divided, and our worldviews are so fundamentally different. It just seems a lot more complicated because of that now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think. I mean, it's always difficult to know. I mean, when you get to a certain age, you sort of remember past debates and past gloom and how it all seemed terrible and things were better a decade ago. I mean, the 70s, as I recall them, were pretty miserable at times. You weren't quite sure how this country could be run effectively and so on. And eventually you recover. So, I do have a keen sense of tragedy as a historian, but if you get overwhelmed by your keen sense of tragedy, you might as well just give up. So I think it's hard. I think it's just important to make the arguments, and I think one of the frustrations with the government, which actually I feel less about in the defence field. I think that I think it's a reasonably impressive document that's come out, but I do worry about in the domestic sense, is just this constant triangulation. So you're just trying to work out what the market will bear and what do you do about reform and so on. And sometimes you've just got to go out and say it.
Especially when you've got a majority of the size.
When you've got a majority which won't last. So I find that frustrating. I think a lot of these do come down in the end to political leadership, which requires the ability to communicate, and Starmer, many qualities, but charisma isn't one of them.
Storyteller, is he?
So it's a problem that you need to be able to go out and sell your policies, and he's not so good at that.
But actually, one area where he is triangulating, and it seems to me to have been spectacularly successful so far, is in foreign policy. That is to say, walking that tightrope between the US.
Yeah, you're right, but it's a different sort. I mean, it's one of necessity. You don't want to make the choice between the US and Europe. You need to keep the show on the road. There's no particular reason why we have to fall out with either if they don't want to fall out with us. And I think he has had, I think on defence and foreign policy, the government found its feet, if you like. I mean, I think they know what they're doing. And they've learned, and they're working quite well with other countries, and for example, with the statement on Gaza with Canada and France. So I think that they can do that, but it's diplomatic, and Starmer's quite good at diplomatic language. It's the ability to go out on the stump and enthuse people about a vision and what they're trying to do. And it's tough, the financial situation is very tough. So it's not easy when you have got to show financial rectitude at the same time. So I don't underestimate the problems. But I think that there are things that can be done and can be spoken about that could... I mean, even if you're just talking about trade-offs honestly, that could be a help.
And it would be useful to hear about where they would take us if they could.
If they could, yeah.
So we have a sense of what they would like to do were it possible.
The vision thing.
The narrative thing. Okay. Oh, good Lord. The mic is somewhere, and Mirren is in charge of where it goes. This is how we delegate our organisation.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk that Starmer, as you said, has been diplomatic, not trying to annoy Trump, but in the background they must be planning to sort of find a way to be less reliant. Is that happening? Is a plan to, in terms of ITAR and move away from American platforms and weapons?
I mean, you'd have to be pretty dim not to realise there's an issue here, and there's always the problem of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you've got an administration that looks slightly bonkers and likely to walk away, do you give them the excuse? So, do you try and tie them in more, or do you just assume the worst? So yeah, I mean, the conversations are obviously going on. I mean, I think intelligence is a good example where, you've got pretty established systems for intelligence sharing. The more routine you make them at working level, the better they tick along. The more they involve meetings with Tulsi Gabbard and so on, the harder they're likely to be. And you get an example of cyber, where a lot of the cyber capabilities in the US have been hit because Trump thought that these were chasing him. We've got pretty good stuff at GCHQ and so on. And they're very frustrated, I think, by not being quite sure who to talk to, even if they want to. So I think there are difficulties that are there. And as the workarounds get developed, then in a sense you're creating not quite a shadow capability, but you're doing more. But it's very difficult. I mean, you just think, on the defense side, the carriers, the F-35, the deterrent, the nuclear submarines. I mean, it's all so integrated with the US. It's very hard to turn that off. So, unsurprisingly, even if you think it's going in that direction, you want to make it as soft a landing as possible and to give yourself time.
But if you think with a longer time horizon, it seems to me there's a direction of travel for the United States, which is to pay less attention to Europe, to focus more on Asia.
Sure, I mean, that's given, and the Defence Review says that. But I think it's more an abrupt break. So, drifting apart a bit is one thing, divorce is another. And I think it's divorce that's scary. Is the Americans more or less sort of turning on us and saying, we don't want to work with you anymore. That would be really difficult. Now, I don't think we'll get that far. I don't think that'll happen. So over the long term, I think we'll do more. And I think going back, said before, when you reach questions about the next generation of aircraft, we're not, we're developing with the Italians and the Japanese. And I think you'll see more of that.
Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. I'm a former MP and army officer, so I want to come back to the war in Europe, if I may. People forget that the Kremlin and Putin have form. I mean, he was doing this in the Caucasus in 2008, long before he invaded Crimea in 2014. And so there are some fairly chilling reminiscences and comparisons with the 1930s. But the one I want to draw your attention to is that Hitler manifestly misunderstood his opponents. He miscalculated what the British would do and such like. Do you think Putin's doing exactly the same thing? I mean, I lecture to some American students, and when I asked them the other day, I said, look, if Putin marched through the Suwalki corridor, invoking ostensibly Article 5, because it would be both Poland and Lithuania, how many of you think that the Americans would come to the aid of Europe in those circumstances? Not a single one of them put up their hands. And I asked them their political affiliations. They were all Democrats. None of them were Republicans. Now, if Putin is working on that assumption that actually Americans not only would not come militarily, but might even prevent American munitions, which are, populate basically European defense, from being used as well, are we not going to see a massive conflagration at some stage because he just won't stop unless he's stopped by a bullet or death?
I mean,
cheer us up, Laurie.
So I think Putin calculates risk, and I think he calculated the risk wrong with Ukraine. I mean, he calculated the risk with Georgia, or Medvedev was in charge then, but go back to Chechnya and so on, which is what gave him his break, really. He wouldn't be president probably without Chechnya. And he worked out what could be done. Syria, he played it quite cleverly. With Crimea, you can argue he played it quite cleverly. with moving into the Donbass in 2014, he limited his liabilities. So I don't think, I think he miscalculated Ukraine because he was contemptuous of Ukraine and had it as the sense of an artificial state. So we spend a lot of time trying to get into his head. We spend an awful lot of time trying to get into the heads of strange people these days, whether it's Putin or Trump or even Xi. And it's quite hard because they're not like us. I think Putin, look, the Russians have just spent over 3.5 years failing to subjugate a country third quarter of their size. I don't think they would be desperately keen to test it all against NATO, because whatever the Americans would do, the Baltic countries would fight, the Swedes would fight, the Finns would fight, we'd fight, I suspect, in some way. And you know, Russia spends 8% of its GDP on defense now, a third of its budget goes on defense, but it's still got a GDP smaller than ours and Germany's and France's and so on. So we really ought to be able to cope and not depend wholly on the Americans. So I think, in my view, I mean, this is my strong belief about our security priority at the moment. The key thing is to keep Ukraine in the game and to make sure that Russia in the end feels defeated, because then I'm not sure they'd try anything else on. If they defeated Ukraine and marched to the border, then we'd be in trouble. Not necessarily because they'd go marching on, but the potential for incidents would be enormous, and they'd be making demands and saying, and something would go wrong at some point. So it would be even more dangerous, and we'd be spending an awful lot more. So that, I think, in a very self-interested way, is rather than just doing right by Ukraine, which we should also do. That's why we have to support Ukraine. So I mean, I'm not. I don't. You can understand why Putin wanted Ukraine. It's not clear why he'd want anything else. And given the trouble he's having getting Ukraine, and the trouble he'd have even if he thought he had it, I'm not sure he could take on much more. But I would be worried about the potential for conflict if he got Ukraine.
And if he was defeated, would we make the same mistake in the West as we did in 1991 and have Emeritus in it?
Well, we did a bit, but I mean, we tried not to. I mean, we gave him rotten economic advice. Somebody remarked, having decades of literature, which I indulged in myself, about the transition from capitalism to socialism. There was very little written about the transition from socialism to capitalism. So I don't think we gave them great advice. We tried. It was just difficult because they had been defeated. I mean, the Soviet Union fell apart. And actually, Clinton put a lot of effort into Yeltsin and so on. And at times it looked like it might be working. So there's this all, we had a debate here the other night about, did we provoke? I don't think we did in the end, but it wasn't good. But it was difficult because Russia was very proud. And to say, actually you're not a great power anymore, they didn't like. So it almost became therapy, and we didn't do the therapy very well.
Thank you. Hi. Many conversations that we have on military spending and security tend to focus very heavily on conventional military tactics and strengthening our conventional military. And this has been reflected in the Strategic Defence Review and other statements by the government in recent months. However, do you think that we need to maybe shift that conversation and focus far more on unconventional military tactics, things such as economic warfare, espionage, manipulative diplomacy, as the nature of warfare changes as it has throughout history?
Well, when you get into, as the Ukrainians demonstrate, and the Russians in their own way too, the longer a conflict goes on, the more the unconventional gets looked at. It's not always that effective, and it's most effective when it's done with the conventional. If you look at propaganda campaigns and so on, if they bear no relationship to what's happening on the ground, they fail because it just looks implausible. So and the economic stuff is going on all the time. There's a lot of it going on. So I think it's worth thinking about. It's quite hard to do in a decisive sort of way. I thought you were going to move on to the nuclear, which is part of it. And it's quite interesting that, given that the Labour government that I grew up with in the 60s and in the 70s didn't even mention the nuclear deterrent. You've now got a government that is urging us not to be ashamed of having a nuclear force, and spending quite a lot on a new warhead and a new submarines. And I think if you look at Russian propaganda, that's sort of warranted, not because they need to be reminded that you can't talk about flattening London without at least some thought about the consequences for yourself. So I think, but that commitment has already been made. I don't particularly see a need to do. There's an issue that was raised more in the pre-review briefing than in the review itself about the possibility of the UK getting a dual-capable system, which would be the F-35A, but that would be with an American weapon. I think there's a case for it, but I wouldn't really make a high emphasis on it. But I think for us in the end, the issue is deterrence, and at a very high level. And you've got to ask what produces the deterrent effect. What is it that is going back to the previous question? What is it that convinces Putin or his successors that this would be a risk too far? And I think that lots of things can contribute to that. And I think we often underestimate the extent to which we appear quite sneaky and clever to them. We sort of look, just to take an example, anybody who followed these things knows that both the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the 2014, now called Revolution of Dignity, in Ukraine were Ukrainian. This reflected a mood amongst a large section of the Ukrainian population. The Russians are convinced that we did it. So they think we do this stuff better than we probably do, and we should encourage them to think that at some point. I'm always amazed. So the Russians and the Iranians, the only two countries that seem impressed by the UK's global reach.
You can keep your questions short because there's a whole load of people want to ask them, and we're running out of time. Please.
You mentioned earlier President Trump's lack of success over Ukraine. You also mentioned the tariffs going to be difficult. Iran has just said, no way. Is that going to be President Trump's final straw? He will have to take military action to get his way?
That's an interesting question. I've actually just been writing on this with the New Statesman, just trying to keep up. The Iranians, the Americans put in a proposal which actually was sort of more conciliatory than many would have liked, but it obviously has a lot of red lines for Iran because Iran wants to enrich uranium. It's put an awful lot of money into preparing for it. I think you can ask why, but they do. And I'm not sure whether this is going to be. I mean, the last I saw, they didn't like it, and more or less. Well, the question is whether they completely rejected it or just went back with counter proposals of their own, which is what I would hope they would do, but I haven't seen it. The problem, I mean, this is one of the big Trump failures in foreign policy, because he inherited the JCPOA, which was the deal that was done with Iran by Obama, because it had been done by Obama and by the EU and Russia for that matter. Trump thought it had to be bad. He walked away from it in 2018, and surprise, surprise, he didn't get a better deal. The Iranians just enriched more uranium, so they're now much closer to a bomb than they would have been if he just stuck with the original deal. They've also were well aware that the idea of eliminating the Iranian nuclear program with succession of airstrikes is a possibility. So their centrifuges are deep underground, well underground. So you would sort of be like hammer blows with some of the biggest weapons before you got there. And then you wouldn't be sure how much you'd knock out, because it depends on how it's all configured below and so on. So it's actually very difficult. It's not like, the strike on Iraq in 1981. It's not like that, or the Israeli strike on Syria in 2007. This would be a really big deal. And it would use a lot of ordnance, and the Pentagon would not be happy, because, this is not the war they particularly want. So I think Trump's got himself in a bit of a bind here. I think the Iranians really would like a deal. Their economy is desperate. The regime is incredibly unpopular. I know Iranians who are exiled who really hope that Trump goes to war with. I mean, as long as he just attacks the nuclear facilities and not Tehran, because they want the clerics out. They don't want to do a deal, but for the same reason. So I think it's not impossible that they will move. There's also just a basic problem of the amateurishness of the same guy Witkoff is trying to do all these deals, and he goes to Russia, he's trying to do Gaza, he's also trying to do this, and he's not got a great record of success so far. He's a more amiable version of Trump. It's very apparent. He's not. I don't think he's stupid, and he appears to be quite a nice guy. But he's a real estate negotiator, and these people believe it's all about land. I think that's one of the problems going back to Ukraine. Why they just thought if you did a deal on land, then everything's all right. They didn't understand all the other stuff. So anyway, you've got a problem. I think if there is an outright rejection, Trump has got an issue, because in a way he's talked himself into having to do strikes, but it wouldn't eliminating, even with the Israelis, eliminating the force. The capability would be very difficult.
All right, we've probably got time for one more. See how it goes. Guy there's had his hand up for ages. You wait for them.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. We'll take them both. Keep it very quick.
Yeah.
We'll do both.
You've spoken about the support and how everyone else is interacting with Ukraine. You've spoken this evening as though Russia's just acting totally on its own. Everybody knows that China and Russia, for example, are quite good buddies, and that they've just met. Do you think that China has had a good deal of support for Russia at the moment, and do you think China's prepared to let Russia lose?
Fair point. I think North Korea and Iran have been actually more important in terms of military capability. China's very important in terms of economics, Russia would be in real trouble without Chinese economic backing. And I don't think Xi wants Putin to lose, no. I don't think he's very impressed. I think, and I don't think China has given Russia everything that Russia would want. He's been very clear. He's not an ally of Russia, but he doesn't want Putin to lose. But I mean, North Korea has made more difference probably militarily than I'm sure it has than China.
I have one question. So today we have a Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Belgium, and tomorrow we have a Minister of Defense conference. So they talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, war. And so can you make some assessment or some comments on these two events? So the two events have any impacts on Russia and Ukraine war? And second question, I'm sorry.
Be very quick, please.
Yeah, very quick. Second question is about today. So UK leader says that they will provide tenfold drones. It means that 100,000 drones for Ukraine. So what do you think about that? What does it mean for Ukraine, and what does it mean for the UK? Can you say? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as you go. I think the interest in all these contact group meetings is what the Americans say and do, just to get any indication of how much support they're prepared to allow, which may include being financed by Europe, but bought from the US, because some of the stuff can only be bought from the US. I mean, lots of countries are providing a lot. I think, just final point on this, I think a number of European countries are aware that actually one of the better things you can do is finance the Ukrainian defense industry, because there's a lot of spare capacity there, because they don't have the capital. And if you did, they can churn the stuff out. Whereas, early on in the war, it was, you had to look to other countries to supply. Increasingly, Ukraine supplies itself, and supporting that, I think, is pretty important.
Laurie, we've run out of time.
Oh,
Thank you ever so much. It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Right, that's it now.